Mark Zuckerberg may be the most powerful person in the world. At no other time in history has a single human had such fine-grained control over the most influential tool for media, which is Facebook. Today's guests are Michael Zimmer and Nick Proferes, the creators of the Zuckerberg Files, which is an index of every recorded word that Mark Zuckerberg has said in text, video, or audio. Why would someone create this? I was partly expecting Michael and Nick to be anti-Facebook because the Zuckerberg Files sounds like a tool to hold the Facebook CEO accountable. It sounds like a watchdog tool. In reality, Michael and Nick have a much more nuanced view of Facebook and Zuckerberg than I expected. They are Facebook users themselves. They love Facebook, I think. I'm probably putting words in their mouth there, but they initially built the Zuckerberg Files as a way to portend the product directions that Facebook might lean towards, particularly those related to privacy. They were really more interested in figuring out where the product was going by virtue of tracking what Mark Zuckerberg said and how directly those utterances translated into product direction. So this is quite an interesting episode, not completely related to software engineering, though there are some elements of software engineering in it. So with that in mind, please send me any feedback you have. If you like this episode, let me know. If you don't like it, let me know. And please send me any related topics or other things you think would make for good shows. And as always, also share any episodes that you like with your friends. This show grows by word of mouth, so I appreciate that. And with that, let's get to this episode, The Zuckerberg Files. How does DevOps change in the age of Docker and Kubernetes? At apprenda.com/sedaily, you can find a webinar about DevOps in the age of Docker and Kubernetes, featuring Gene Kim, author of the Phoenix Project. Gene was instrumental in popularizing the DevOps movement, and at apprenda.com/sedaily, he will be discussing the topic with speakers from Google and Apprenda. Docker and Kubernetes have exploded in popularity, and with these changes, there has been a shift in focus from automation to full orchestration in distributed environments. Learn from Google's experiences running containers and clusters at massive scale, and learn from Gene Kim's explanation of the state of DevOps at apprenda.com/sedaily. Thank you to Apprenda for being a continued sponsor of SE Daily. And if you're a listener who wants to support Software Engineering Daily while also learning about DevOps and Docker and Kubernetes, check out apprenda.com/sedaily. Apprenda provides cloud platform software that works with your existing applications and infrastructure. So if you are looking for an enterprise platform as a service, you might also want to check out apprenda.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Apprenda. Michael Zimmer and Nick Proferes work on the Zuckerberg Files. Michael and Nick, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So the Zuckerberg Files is an archive of all the public statements from Facebook's founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg. Why did you create this?
So it's been out there for a number of years now, and one of the main motivations that I had in putting the Zuckerberg Files together was really trying to get an understanding of how does Zuckerberg talk about things like privacy, like the Zuckerberg, the Facebook users. How does he talk about advertising? How does he talk about what sharing information will do for us? And this stemmed out of a number of conversations that I've had with other colleagues and students at conferences within the internet research community about just how is this whole Facebook phenomenon being put together, and what's the role of the way that Zuckerberg thinks about these issues and how he's shaping this platform. So it was actually, on a whim where we're having beers and we're talking about these things and we're saying, wouldn't it be great if we just started collecting everything that he says so we can study it and try to understand the way that he thinks? Because we saw this really close connection between sort of Zuckerberg's, personal ideology and what he was doing with this platform. So I got some people together and we started to create it, and it's been growing ever since.
Yeah, and I would add that one of our colleagues, Anna Lauren Hoffman, was instrumental also in sort of the genesis of this idea.
Absolutely.
So you noticed that Zuckerberg and Facebook were very effective at carrying out a epitomization of what Zuckerberg would be talking about in media or on his Facebook account in terms of, hey, this is how I view privacy. We're entering this new domain of how privacy, of the things that you can expose about yourself on the internet and how much you're sharing. And you notice that there was a incredibly direct correlation between what Zuckerberg would say and how policies would be implemented on Facebook. So you created the Zuckerberg Files to portend what kinds of things people can expect on Facebook and perhaps privacy abroad, because Facebook kind of sets the tone for a lot of privacy policies throughout social media. Is that accurate?
Well, that was kind of our hypothesis going in. I was giving a talk where I was noticing some shifts in how Facebook approaches privacy. And I was also then noticing some shifts in how Zuckerberg kind of talks about it or justifies it or apologizes for Facebook for changes that were happening on the platform. And that's what kind of motivated this. Well, I wonder if the way that he talks about this has changed over time, or now that they have advertising, or now that they're a public company. How is this changing the way that he talks about his goals and aspirations for the platform, and how does that feed into how the platform is actually designed? So that's what I think is the real power of this archives now. It gives us a chance as researchers to really try to understand his rhetoric and how that relates to a number of different kinds of aspects of the way that Facebook impacts us as users.
Yeah, and I'd add that it's also really important to understand how his rhetoric has changed in relationship to different things that Facebook is undergoing in terms of its IPO, in terms of its changes that it makes to the platform, right? And understanding sort of the relationship between the social and the technical is really critically important for understanding this very complex phenomena that is Facebook.
Is this at all about creating a platform that is sort of a watchdog on what Zuckerberg is saying to track potential hypocrisy?
I mean, that wasn't the intent going in, but it certainly can have that kind of impact. And it has been very illuminating, and a number of people have written both scholarly articles and essays, in more popular media identifying where these kinds of changes happen. I'm in the process of updating it right now for some of his more recent speeches, where he's also talking a lot more about the Internet.org initiative for providing internet access across the globe. We'll be adding yesterday's announcement about some of the health initiatives that he and his wife are doing through the foundation. And that might be the kind of thing where we start seeing, are there some nuances or some contradictions in terms of how he says one thing in one context, but maybe something else in a different context.
Yeah, understanding how he talks to different audiences at different points was, I think, another really critical thing that the Zuckerberg Files sort of allows us to do. And the other thing I'd add is that, in addition, there's not necessarily a lot of resources that scholars can necessarily go to in order to get access to this kind of archival material. Very often they have to do this kind of work on their own. And having something for the scholarly community more broadly, it isn't necessarily operating in a watchdog scenario, but more making resources available to others that are interested in these topics.
So maybe this is not really in your. So okay, are you more interested in creating a resource that other people can use, or are you more interested in understanding what people actually think about in terms of sharing? Like, you have these questions on the Zuckerberg Files website where you talk about these are the questions we need to be asking about social media and sharing, and it sounds like the motivation that really drives you is, how do people think about sharing information? This is such, we've had Facebook for like 10 years or something, but this is still very raw territory. And there's, stuff comes up all the time where it's like, oh, this is surprising that people are willing to share this, or maybe we share too much, and then there's some reining in of the public, ways that people share. But it seems like you are more curious in this the nature of how people feel about sharing, and the fact that you ended up creating a platform that people are using maybe to track Zuckerberg's hypocrisy or whatever else he says, that was coincidental. And it sounds like you're more interested in the sociological questions of what are humans willing to share, what is practical about sharing, what's the utility of sharing.
Well, I think we could separate those two. So, I entered this with an idea about, I want to try to understand how Zuckerberg thinks about privacy and sharing and information flows. And one way for me to do that as a researcher is to look at his rhetoric. So having this kind of archive helps me do that. And then on the other side... So
you were specifically interested in Zuckerberg, not like the sociological question of what do people care about?
Well, we can think about this in terms of different layers of that question. I have a broader concern of that broadly, and in particular, given the dominance of Facebook in our contemporary society, I was looking at that one piece of it. But also as a researcher, I realized this is a resource that I can make available to others. So other people are using the Zuckerberg Files for other kinds of purposes. Some are trying to understand how he talks about innovation. Some are just trying to get inspiration about how to lead a company and how to and looking at Zuckerberg as an example of that. So there's over 200 researchers that have gotten access to the files for a variety of different kinds of reasons.
And I'd add to this that I think I have a slightly different reason for my interest in the Zuckerberg Files, which is in part that, part of how we learn how to use the technology is, we might get a technology and just kind of try to figure out how to use it on our own. We might watch someone else use it, right? But we take in a lot of messages about technology and about a technology's role in our lives, potential role in our lives, and how to use a technology. And Zuckerberg has a very strong prominence in creating those kinds of messages, not just because he says it and people read his blog, but also because the words that he uses get picked up by the media and get repeated, right? And that becomes very strongly influential in sort of users creating expectations and mental models about, sort of what's appropriate, how I should maybe approach sharing on Facebook, who might use Facebook, how I might share information with those others. So I'm very interested in sort of the relationship and a kind of middle ground between those two endpoints.
Michael, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting, where you said people are following what he says, following what Zuckerberg says very closely because they're looking for ways to run a company or they're looking for inspiration. I think that we have entered this age. Maybe I'm mistaken about this. Maybe we've been in this age for a while, but we've been in this age where these tech CEOs are almost like a new level of celebrity that is beyond what we knew maybe in the 90s or even in the early 2000s, where these people like Zuckerberg or Bezos or Larry Page, they achieve this prominence where what they say is almost like a messianic type of thing, where they can say something and people will use that as, this is so inspirational, or I should model myself after this. And in many cases, that's not a bad thing, because many of these people have done something really inspirational, and it's often built off of very strong and interesting and unique principles that are positive and forward-looking. But what made you focus on Zuckerberg? Why not Larry Page or Bezos or one of these other tech messiahs, Elon Musk or something?
Right. No, that's a great question. And I think, Zuckerberg has that kind of ethos like Steve Jobs had with Apple, where his identity is so intimately intertwined with the platform, as well as his hands-on development of the platform. And if you watch The Social Network, you see the fictionalized version of all that. But he built Facebook, and he still is highly involved in at the very product level and the coding level in terms of what we can do with Facebook, in terms of what kind of features.
And not to mention, Not to mention the attachment and the devotion of his employees.
Right.
I have never seen anything like that. And I see it all the time doing interviews with Facebook employees talking to people about Facebook.
It's a compelling story. I mean, of course, he's this young guy that quits college and becomes one of the richest people on the planet. And at the same time, I think we also have a closer, or what feels like a closer relationship to him because of our relationship to his platform than we do to like the president of Universal Pictures or of Chevrolet or some other company that we all deal with in our day-to-day lives. But it's the nature of the platform where we see him using it. We can interact with him on the platform. He puts up videos. We can see him playing with his baby. There is a different kind of relationship. And then it's this inspiring story about building something that almost overnight becomes one of the most important platforms in the world. So I think there's a lot of interesting reasons why he is so important. When I've been out to Facebook and I've talked with policy people on a variety of issues, I hear stories where we did it that way because that's what Zuck wanted, or we didn't put that privacy protection in place because Zuck didn't want that, or you hear those kinds of stories, which are hearsay, but that's what compels me to think about his particular role in the company. He's not just pushing out financial reports and shaking hands with investors. He's really integral to how that company runs in a way similar to Steve Jobs. And I'm actually hoping to sort of expand, and Nick and I have talked about this, expanding this platform into doing this for someone like Larry Page or Marissa Mayer or the people at Twitter or other kinds of companies, because I think there is still that kind of connection between their kind of worldview and what ends up being coded onto their platforms.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me, having spent so much time digging through the language that he uses, is that Zuckerberg also really invokes that relationship. It's not just this one-way thing. I mean, obviously he posts videos and stuff like that, but like when responding to things that have gone wrong on Facebook, like in relationship to Beacon and and sort of public outcry, he often invokes this personal care as I'm going to strive to fix this problem, right? And it's this very individualistic sort of response to a problem.
Indeed, yeah. And I think you both have kind of touched on this thing. I've heard it called asymmetric intimacy, where you feel like you have an intimate relationship with a public figure or a media figure just because you see them all the time, or you see their particularly this is made more intense on Facebook, where you see their videos or their statements all the time online, and you get this feeling that, I know this person, except they don't feel that way about you. And I think it's kind of a unique thing. But getting away from the messianic discussion, more about the discussion of privacy. Do either of you, so as you're studying these Zuckerberg files, these statements by Mark Zuckerberg, what are the things about privacy that emanate from his statements that perhaps the media or individuals, what are the more subtle things or the themes that you pick up on that you might have particular knowledge or ability to articulate that other people who are not perusing the entire corpus of Mark Zuckerberg's statements would think of?
One thing that I've noticed is a shifting in how he frames privacy in relation to users' ability to control information. In fact, when he first launched Facebook, privacy does emerge because he was, if you remember from The Social Network, they fictionalized how he got in trouble for creating Face Mash, where he took the students, all the women at Harvard and put them side by side to compare, who's more attractive. And so when he launched Facebook, literally just a few months after that, on the Harvard campus, he talks about privacy, that we have privacy controls, because he was worried about that kind of campus backlash. But then once it became a little bit larger and started going on their campuses, privacy wasn't part of his discussion. It was all about openness and sharing, and that we will be better if we share. We'll have better relationships. We'll have a better world if we share information, and you shouldn't want to keep things private. And it was always this kind of a scolding, kind of approach towards privacy. And then later on, when there became a little bit more of a public backlash, he started talking about, well, we do have controls. You control your information. And that's the way that we're approaching privacy. It was about user control. And that we're not doing things without permission. And then now, actually, he doesn't talk much about privacy anymore. And it's not that, we're not dealing with these problems, but I think he sees it as resolved in his eyes. We are now sharing. We're now okay with this. We'll have the controls in place and things like that. But he's, again, shifting back towards this sort of open society model that as long as we have information flowing and people have access to information, we'll be much better off. So it's one thing I'm actually in the process now of trying to trace the rhetoric he uses on privacy and trying to sort of map it up against what's happening with the company and what's happening in the world to see what kind of relationships I can find.
Yeah, I had a couple conversations around this topic of the openness. I talked to somebody from the EFF a couple weeks ago. We had a long conversation about this, and I brought up that one thing that I feel, and having grown up in the Facebook world, I'm probably biased, but I feel like we have this weird narrative in our society that is partially probably attributable to 1984, where we say, if we have these things where we're sharing by default and we have this increasing feeling of being surveilled, we are asymptoting towards the dystopian world of 1984, and that is a bad thing. And my sense is that some of what Zuckerberg, when he was speaking out in favor of openness, that was some of what he was pushing back against. Was he was saying, just because we have these technologies that are, you could frame them as increasing surveillance, that doesn't mean that we're trending towards this dystopian surveillance society. But the thing is that Zuckerberg, and I can say for myself also, is a white male living in America who doesn't have a whole lot to worry about by sharing everything. There are people who, if they shared their default everyday things, beliefs, behaviors, they might be executed. And so there's no safe global norm of privacy. And part of that is due to unfortunate prejudices or dictatorships or whatever you want to call it. But maybe that's why he has trouble, or he has stopped giving these public edicts about here's how we should do privacy, here's how we should do sharing, because there's no one size fits all. There's really no one size fits all, and there won't be for a long time, because we have these problematic cultures, or just inequality. I'm sure even in America you could say, like, there's still so much prejudice in certain places. Do you think that that's an accurate assessment of the privacy history narrative for him?
I mean, that's a lot of the complexity that we're starting to uncover, and our colleague Anna Hoffman has written on this as it relates to questions of identity on Facebook. And just like you're saying, Zuckerberg comes from a particular, background and context in his life where having an identity is a pretty simple, non-complicated thing. But if you are, a person of color, if you're a trans person, there's all kinds of reasons why your identity becomes really complex, could be contentious, and could even be dangerous in terms of how it's framed or how it's exposed. And Facebook gets in trouble for this because they create like a real name policy where you have to use your real name, and you can't use the name that's different than what's on your what happened to be on your birth certificate or whatever kind of document. And that just doesn't work in a lot of people's world. And those are some of these interesting things that we're identifying when we start going through his language and how he frames what it means to be a Facebook user. It oftentimes is this very simplistic kind of worldview as a consequence of his upbringing, that then becomes translated into how the platform's developed, and that's some of the problems that we're trying to illuminate.
Yeah, and I'd add that that's also part of the historical conditions from which Facebook emerged. Like,
right.
It was originally, a technology used by college students, right, who are of
Ivy League college students.
Yeah, Ivy League college students who are a very particular type, right? And as Facebook has expanded, and as Facebook is under pressure to grow its user base, right, it's expanding to have a larger and larger diversity of users, and it's a real big social challenge.
And from your points of view, how is he handling that evolving social challenge as Facebook becomes a global organization, and it's but simultaneously cannot serve this one-size-fits-all purpose?
Well, it's still imperfect. I mean, one thing you notice when you study 10 years of him speaking is that he is getting much better in terms of like corporate communication and corporate speak. It's not him throwing out a quick blog post at midnight to apologize for something or stumbling over an answer. He's become more polished. He's become probably more safe in his language at the same time, and you can sort of see that happening. And I also think he's trying to, at least in terms of what he does now publicly, is trying to move himself, kind of above, the messiness that we want to try to deal with when he's talking more about things like internet.org, or the new, his foundation and the health initiative, and he's trying to move Facebook strategically as this vehicle for public good. And I think he's kind of hopeful that the dirty, messy things about identity and privacy and governance of the platform that we want to try to understand, I think he's hoping that all just kind of resolves itself, through time.
DreamHost Cloud gives you fast virtual machines and storage for a low price. DreamHost Cloud brings infrastructure as a service together with 24/7 support and a great community. The DreamHost Cloud platform is all based on open source code that uses OpenStack and Ceph. Go to dreamhost.com/SEDaily to deploy your application today and support Software Engineering Daily. With the easy-to-use UI, standard API, and a powerful SSD infrastructure backend, DreamHost Cloud has everything that you need to deploy and maintain your application. The billing for virtual machines is simple. Only 600 hours are billed max per VM per month with 100 gigabytes block storage included and free bandwidth for a limited time. It's easy to try at dreamhost.com/SEDaily. Deploy your application to DreamHost Cloud today. I know you've got that side project waiting for its deployment, and when you decide to deploy it, check out DreamHost at dreamhost.com/SEDaily. Thanks to DreamHost for being a sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Now let's get on with this episode. I think you totally encapsulated that strategy from what I see. Do you think he has become decreasingly willing to commit to certain statements about, oh, this is how privacy is going to work, or this is how sharing is going to work, this is going to be the openness? Has it become more of, it seems like it's become more of like a statement about things that we can all agree on? Like the things that he's willing to say have become much more positive, universally accessible statements that he's not going to get harangued for in the near future. Do you think that's accurate? He's become more diplomatic.
Yeah, I think he's become much more mission based. There's a real shift where making the world more open and connected just starts really getting hammered over and over and over, right? And that's around 2000, 2008, 2009, and I think that's really just sort of taken over as the sort of mantra.
Yeah, and some of that might be maturity. He's no longer a 20-year-old kid. He has a family. He has so perhaps he's learning how to what is his role, and to not feed those fires. It could be out of safety, it could be out of maturing. That's some of that I think us and other scholars might start exploring a little bit more as well.
Okay, let's talk about internet.org as an example, because this is like one of my favorite topics, and I ask a lot of people about this. I ask like random engineers who I'm interviewing about some technical thing on Facebook. I'll just ask them like, what do you think of the internet.org stuff? Because I thought this was just such a strange case. This was obviously where Facebook was trying to launch a widespread adoption of this internet.org thing, which is basically like a walled garden version of the internet, but it doesn't have any rate limiting. So it's kind of like selectively you can get free Wikipedia, free Facebook, free some other things, but there are other features of the internet that you will just not find at all on internet.org. And India, depending on how you want to classify the population of India, basically said, no, we don't want this thing. So from your perspective, how did his narrative change as it became clear that India was not going to just accept internet.org as the service that Zuckerberg wanted it to be?
Yeah, Nick, I don't know if you've isolated that. I'm just starting to get some of the newer content into the system where we're doing with this challenge, and I have a couple of speeches and a couple of town hall meetings he made in Delhi, and also he had a town hall meeting with the Prime Minister of India, and I'm just getting those processed now. So I don't know if we've been able to isolate his rhetoric on that yet. Yeah.
Well, I will mention that one of the people on the board for Facebook, and I'm half remembering this, but made some interesting comments after Facebook Free Basics was looking like it was going to fail, that really infuriated a lot of people. And they didn't come from Zuck, obviously, but I think it's also sort of worth looking at sort of the corporate language more broadly in this particular case.
Interesting. Well, maybe you'll have to do a entirety of Facebook board files to track, I guess, all of their discussions. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the engineering of the Zuckerberg Files, because obviously the show is called Software Engineering Daily. How are you aggregating all of the textual and audio and video things that Zuckerberg is saying and indexing it?
Well, it's a horribly manual process at this point, where I have a handful of assistants who are helping identify source material out on the web. So some of it is going through his feed, going through Facebook's own communication and press postings, where we find things, going through YouTube, where there's either official videos from TechCrunch or Y Combinator or other kinds of events, or people that happen to have a flip phone out and recording him giving a talk at an 8th grade graduation or something like that. And we're grabbing that content. I am if there's things that need to be transcribed, a YouTube video, I'm using a third party to do the transcriptions, and then we're uploading it all into a digital library that's housed at UW-Milwaukee. And that's what's creating the archive itself. So it's kind of a manual process. As we find things, we track it, we create records, and we upload it. So we have it all there. And Nick, you can talk about how we do the actual coding and research aspect if you want.
Yeah, so once we have sort of the text transcriptions, then we've sort of imported them into an in vivo database, which is a piece of qualitative analysis software. And there's a certain amount of automated coding that we can do. It'll tag keywords and give us keyword proximity for some things, but actually a lot of what we do is just manual, like going through and reading the things, tagging. We have a sort of a coding scheme that we use to sort of look at a couple of different things, topic areas that we know are sort of buttons. So like how Zuckerberg talks about the business and finance aspects of Facebook, how he talks about if he's mentioning like things around privacy or sharing, if he's talking about sort of his conceptions of what Facebook is as a technology or is as a business, whether he's talking about users, if so, how is he talking about users? Is he defining users? So that kind of stuff. And we have to go through and just sort of read everything very slowly and tag everything manually. And I'd say that I spent a good 2.5 months of my life reading every single thing that Mark Zuckerberg has said in public that we had and tagging it. So I feel like I have been in his mind a little bit.
And other researchers are doing. I have a few linguists who are doing linguistic analysis. There was at least a handful of researchers that are actually using some of the text to help inform some machine learning algorithms for speech recognition. So there's a variety of different ways that people are kind of churning through the data.
Oh man, somebody needs to build a Mark Zuckerberg bot.
I think someone might be playing around with that. Yeah.
That would be so awesome. It'd be so inspiring. You could have inspiration on demand.
I have a number of students on my campus that have listened to enough Zuckerberg videos where they can do pretty good impressions. So yeah, and he does talk exactly. I mean, there is definitely clear mannerisms in his speech. So yeah,
there certainly are. Nick, having read so much Zuckerberg narration, you probably have read more words by Zuckerberg than perhaps anybody else. I mean, I don't know. Maybe the people who wrote the books. I imagine you've read like the Facebook books and stuff, right? Like the histories. Yeah. So, what do you think of him as a leader after studying him so much? Is there anything that worries you, or are you like, oh, Zuckerberg for president, Zuckerberg for dictator of the world? How do you feel about Zuckerberg?
I think I have kind of a mixed view on him. I think that he got better. And he became much more polished. I think there's some really interesting stuff that he does. Particularly, he used to do and talk about a lot these yearly challenges that he would do, like where he would wear a tie every day for a year, or he was learning Chinese and stuff like that's actually kind of really neat, just to sort of get an idea of how does someone actually, or like in this kind of position, actually organize their life a little bit. I think that he has gotten a lot more polished. I think that in a lot of ways it's harder to get sort of the real interesting moments in sort of his speech are where he gets caught a little bit off guard, or he responds a little more candidly. You just get an insight right into something deeper about how he views the relationship between Facebook and users, which is something that I'm very, very interested in.
Yeah. Do you think he is at all, and does he have subversive, I don't want to say subversive, but does he have any from reading all of his text, do you get the sense that there are nefarious ulterior motives that are at odds with what he says to the public?
I don't. I think there's early on a lot of, I guess, what I would describe as naivete.
Yeah.
And then there's also a lot of, from my perspective, mistakes or imperfect decisions because of a very kind of, what I'll describe as a very engineering approach to social problems and to social issues like sharing and identity and privacy. And he had because he was only 20 years old and really wasn't much of a social person and didn't really have a full understanding of the complexities of life out there. And he had what he thought was a clean engineering solution to getting people to share things. And I think that caused a lot of problems. And I don't think it was him trying to collect information to mess with us or to make it available because he can make money. I think that's one interesting thing that I've noticed, is that he never really seemed to have a profit motive in what he's doing. I think he reluctantly engage with advertising because he knew he needed that in order to keep the lights on and to do the things he really thinks the platform is capable of. So I never got that sense of this kind of ulterior motive. At the same time, he was never this really strong advocate for user rights or privacy or things that maybe that you might be seeing with Tim Cook at Apple or other kinds of organizations. So there was kind of this middle ground that he seemed to be sitting on.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that there was ever really any alternative or ulterior motives that he really had or that I got a sense of. I do think that, I don't agree with necessarily some of his worldviews, but I don't think that there's anything that's like sneaky or hidden about what he's saying.
Well, what do you disagree with?
Well, I think one of the things that he talks about sort of later on, and as Facebook grows as an entity and starts taking on new kinds of users, and he starts sort of equating brands with people, and I think that that's kind of a little bit of a problematic situation in the sense that it sort of flattens the real big differences between what it means to be an individual and what it means to be a brand. So things like that where. I think that particularly some of the early stuff in his responses to people's outrage over privacy problems on Facebook was also maybe not terribly slick. When we think about the post he had in response to an outrage, which was, calm down, breathe, we hear you.
Right.
I don't think that I think it was a little pedantic.
Yeah.
But, things like that.
And I believe you're both sociologists. Is that right? Or you?
Oh, that's a complex question.
Yeah.
I deal with information ethics.
Okay.
And work work in an information school. I was trained in communication and philosophy of technology, so I'm all kinds of things. And I think Nick is probably even more confusing than I am. So.
Yeah, I would say I'm an information scientist, and very broadly, I look at the relationship between the social and the technical.
Okay, perfect. So, do you both, or either of you, believe that Facebook has a dangerous amount of power? Because some people believe this has become, the one and only newspaper that everybody's reading, and they're controlling our opinion.
Yeah.
What's your stance on that?
So for myself, that's actually been this really interesting kind of new set of discourse that's emerged in the last year or so that Zuckerberg is just now starting to engage with, and I'm starting to get that into the archive about whether or not Facebook contributes to a filter bubble, and do they have a unreasonable amount of control over what is visible in our feeds, and since Facebook is used as a news source for so many people, do they have some kind of obligation to provide news in a fair or some kind of unbiased manner? And I don't feel that Facebook purposefully has taken control over our access to information and news, but I think now that that's how people are using the platform, we need to be really concerned about the kinds of algorithms and the kinds of automation that they have in place, both in terms of what's included and what's excluded by people's visibility. And I think this is a space that they're just now starting to come to terms with and realize that they have to look at this much more closely than before. I think before they're looking at this very algorithmically, and we just create a feed and it has these inputs and we'll give you your news for today. And now I think they do need to step back and sort of rethink how they're approaching this.
Yeah, I think that in addition to them recognizing it, other people are certainly recognizing the power that they have to shape how people have access to information. I mean, a big part of the reason that people got so upset about algorithmic curation of what's trending in terms of news, right, is very much so questions about bias, right? And why should we care about bias? Well, the reason we're going to care about bias is because we really do think that it has an impact, right, on people's what people see and what people experience. I think the other piece of this for me is that Facebook has also become sort of the identity service for the web. It has really become and particularly through acquisitions, the way that we access, the WhatsApp acquisition has really raised a lot of questions about what it means for Facebook to have so much now information about people. It started off as this sort of directory, but now, we have to log in through, third-party websites using Facebook, right? And what does that mean for, our travels more broadly throughout the web and the way that we interact with the web more generally speaking? There's an interesting study that came out, I think it was earlier this year, that, some people were actually confusing Facebook for the internet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was related to the concerns about internet.org. That was what people were like, oh, we don't want this to be the first internet service that people use because they're just going to confuse Facebook for the internet. I don't know. So what about sharing? You have these list of questions on the Zuckerberg Files website, and you discuss sharing as a crucial action that we need to better understand as a society. So when somebody chooses to share information on social media, why are they sharing that data? What motivates somebody to share?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that people share things. I mean, I think that they feel a sense of closeness. I think that it gives them a better sense of their own identity. I think that people, they are performing their identity, and that feels good to do.
Right.
I think that people share because, as actually a lot of research has shown, you sort of enforce social connections by doing that, or reinforce them. I mean, there's a variety of reasons that people share information. You just want to be up to date with sort of what's going on and let people know what's going on in your life.
Is there a disutility of not sharing information online? Like, what is so? If I am, for example, a privileged white male with very little to hide, why wouldn't I share information? Why wouldn't I share as much as going on with me as possible? Why wouldn't I share information as a default?
Well, if you can give me your bank account password and HIV status and some other things right now, I mean, there's always this question of choosing what to share, choosing what not to share. It's not about not having anything to hide. It's about just managing, the spheres around you and being able to maintain a certain level of control over, I want to share in this context, or maybe I'll share something different than that context. And one of the challenges we have is that when we embrace a platform like Facebook, I see two things happening. One, these contexts collapse, and that creates a lot of challenge. In terms of, I thought I was just sharing with these people, but now all of a sudden, either because I lost control of that information or I didn't understand how the platform was working, that information is leaked beyond what I thought it was going to be. And then we also run into this broader social assumption that because a lot of people are sharing a lot of things on Facebook, that means they must be comfortable sharing everything, and everyone's comfortable sharing everything, and that's certainly not the case. We're selective in how we do things, and I think that's a big reason why colleagues and scholars like us are interested in this phenomenon. But Nick, I interrupted you.
Oh no, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, context is really, really important in understanding. I think a piece of this is do users actually have the ability to understand,
right?
Who they're actually sharing with. Right. So if I make something quote unquote public, right, does that mean that I fully understand who all of the people are that are going to use this information? Do I understand how Facebook's actually going to use my information? How Facebook might serve me advertising in relationship to what I'm sharing? We have a very limited scope of understanding of what it actually means to share something. I feel like, and that's a little bit of a problem for users. There's a tremendous asymmetry that's going on when I share something on Facebook.
Right, and I shared something just yesterday, and I only shared it to my friends, and then one of my friends saw it, and then they shared it, and I was like, oh, I mean, maybe it sounds like really naive, but I was like, oh, I have no control over this staying within the domain of my friends. But when I share it with just my friends, that was the feeling I got. I was like, oh, this is just going to go out to my friends. It's not going to go to the broader populace. But then one of my friends shared it, and I was like, oh, I don't have great control over this. And I'm a software engineer. I'm embedded in this stuff all day, and it was just funny because it was just this slight moment where I was like, oh, this is counter to my intuition. And I think it gets at that there's, when we think about sharing something, it's like, oh, I'm sharing it with the public, but there are all these gradations of sharing. Like on WhatsApp, you send a message to one person, you've shared information with that one person. And with Facebook being linked to WhatsApp, maybe the rules are different for how that one-to-one communication perhaps will propagate more broadly, whether we're talking about to advertisers or we're talking about Facebook recommending friends to us and latent information passing through that type of interaction. There was obviously that case recently where two patients of the same psychiatrist were suggested by Facebook to become friends of one another.
Right.
Is there a legal framework around shared information? Do we have adequate laws in place? Do we need more laws? Well, I guess there's the antitrust. It sounds like there's some antitrust stuff brewing in the EU as usual around WhatsApp and Facebook.
Well, I mean, the legal terrain, of course, is murky and never up to date in terms of what social practice is, especially around technology. When we share things, from a legal perspective, we're giving Facebook a license to that information, which allows them to show it on my phone and on my computer and on your phone and your computer. As we go through there, the electronic wiretap laws and other kinds of laws we have are very outdated because there's an assumption that if I share information with a third party, therefore I'm allowing anyone to have that information. So my email is on Gmail servers, therefore anyone can have my email is literally how that law is interpreted because it was written, in 1986 or something like that. So we're slowly, working on trying to resolve those issues, and that's a challenging process in itself. But the example you brought up with, you sharing something with your friends, and you put a control on that, but then you were still caught off guard when it got reshared to a larger thing. I mean, that's an example of why I think it's so important for us to interrogate and understand the discourse that people like Zuckerberg use around things like sharing and privacy. Because Zuckerberg frames privacy as control, and we gave you control over that information. And you used that control when you shared it because you limited it to just friends. And from his perspective, that's mission accomplished. But what you revealed is that it's much more complicated than just having that simple one-step user control, because this is a sharing environment. This is a whole socio-technical system where it's not just as simple as giving someone a granular control and now we've solved the privacy problem. And you're a smart, computer engineer, so and you understand these things, and you still were caught off guard. So I think that stories like that, help explain and justify why we're going through this kind of exercise.
Mm. So, do you both use Facebook?
Yep. A lot.
A lot.
A decent amount, I would say.
So, what do you two do full time? How does the Zuckerberg Files fit into the other things you're doing, and how much work are you spending on it?
Okay, so from my perspective, I'm a full-time professor at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and Zuckerberg Files is just one of my projects. So I find time, I try to find money so I can pay students and assistants to help assist. And it literally I was in a meeting the other day, doing with everything that's going on in the meeting, and at the same time I'm downloading files and downloading transcripts and updating the site. So it becomes just one of these balls that I juggle, throughout my career to help keep this updated. And that's just kind of maintaining the site. And that's, I guess, one of the challenges that I failed to foresee is that this is going to be a constantly updating and growing archive. So right now I'm actually out, trying to get some additional funds to help pay for the ongoing support and keeping the site going.
Yeah, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Maryland, so I work on a variety of different research projects, and this is just sort of one of them. And I'm kind of in the same boat, where just juggling a lot of different stuff. But usually all of these things have some kind of thread in common in terms of looking at the relationship between the social and the technical.
Got it. Well, I think that's a great place to close off. I guess one last question I have is kind of random, but how do you transcribe the audio and the video stuff? Because listeners have been asking to get transcripts of the podcast, and all of the options that I've looked at are like really expensive.
Right. So at first I had students sitting with headphones listening and typing, and that was painful, and that was slow, and they were going slowly insane because it was Zuckerberg.
Yeah, it's a little easier to read it than to listen to it.
Yeah.
That's like a Clockwork Orange type of thing.
Yeah.
It was. Guy, like, sitting in front of the
incoming freshman,
with his eyes peeled open.
Yeah, and she just turned to me and said, "I just can't listen to him anymore." And so I actually use an online service called rev.com. And it's not cheap. It's $1 a minute, and they'll transcribe, and they also will do, it's called verbatim. Well, they'll include the ums and the pauses and the coughs, which actually I do include because I'm also curious as to when, like Nick was mentioning, when you can find out when he's uncomfortable with something or when he's caught off guard, and you can try to gauge that through some of the nuance in his language. When does he struggle with an answer versus have it just roll off his tongue?
Yeah, and actually, like you start seeing kind of a drop off in the number of ums.
Yes.
The further along in the archive that you get, which is kind of interesting. Like he gets much more polished.
Yeah, and that's, I haven't mapped it out yet, but I remember seeing somewhere, someone in Facebook mentioned that they got, professional, help for him to do public speaking. Because again, he's just this computer programming kid that suddenly turned into this public figure. And you can't see that in the archive. So yeah, I use them to do the transcriptions.
Very cool.
And they do a great job. So maybe they'll give me a free one. So.
Yeah, referral code. I wonder if they use Mechanical Turk or something behind the scenes.
I suspect that they do because the turnaround is often very, very quick. If I have a 10-minute video, I often get the transcript back within a half an hour. I have longer videos that take longer, and then oftentimes we have people with accents, or there's other kinds of things that take a little bit longer to do. But yeah.
Well, Michael and Nick, I want to thank you for coming on the show. This has been a really interesting conversation, definitely outside the scope of what we typically cover on Software Engineering Daily, but I think it's funny because listeners actually like these. It seems like they like these types of shows more than they actually like shows about software engineering. So maybe more tangential shows are in the future. Thanks for coming on the show, you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to Symfano for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symfano is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symfano.com/sedaily. That's symphono.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Symfano.
Wow.